My name is Maddie Schuler, Project Officer with CPHA, and I have the honor of introducing our next plenary speaker, Dana Teja Tram, presenting Bending Lines into Circles. Dana has devoted over 6 years of service to the Vuntut Gwitchin First Nation and the Gwitchin Nation, with 4 of those years as chief. His work has been transformative, leading to significant advancements in land protections and sustainable development. His efforts have not only benefited Northern communities, but have also set a precedent for other nations to follow. His leadership skills were recognized on an international level when he was named a Time 100 Next Rising Leader and Clean 50 Emerging Leader. Welcome, Dana. Sorry, Dana, you're muted. There we go.
Am I coming through okay now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, unfortunately, my recording device, my headphones are not working, so I hope that my audio is okay. I apologize. It was working well before, and then as soon as the shift happened. So in any case, I want to give the deepest gratitude to Ms. Schuler, who coordinated with me for so long, but also to the conference and to everybody listening and all the hard work that goes behind all of this. Funny enough, leading up to the days before I submitted my presentation to the organization, I decided not to. I've used these slides quite a bit with images contrasting from the first civilization, graphs to today, to indigenous technologies, all of the rest. But I decided differently, and I'll tell you why. First of all, I'd like to tell you where I'm speaking from today. My name is Dana Teja Tram, former chief of the Vuntut Gwitchin First Nation, among other things. Every one of those accolades and titles that you had heard are not mine. They were my mentors, such as Lorraine Nitro, who spent intense amounts of time with me to help me see and become a conduit and tool of our people and our stories and our knowledge systems. The voice that I'm speaking to you with now is not mine. Our last name, Deja, which could not be properly spoken by the French, called us Teja, but Deja is an ancient name that means speaks with loud voice. And I'm really happy our former panelist, my brother in indigeneity, spoke about 30,000 years ago in British Columbia, because if you look at Bluefish Caves, you can find human evidence, archaeological evidence, about 40 kilometers outside of my community, an ungulate's jawbone with obvious human tooling and striations that carbon dates to 24,000 years ago. However, our stories go back even further than that, millennia ago. And I will get into that. The other side of my name, Tram, we've recently found out goes back millennia into German mythology, as Odin came from Woden, who came from Woden. While Woden traveled with a shiny raven as his council member, which was Birath-Raban in that ancient Germanic language, which turned into Bertram, which turned into Tram. So on both sides of my family, we can trace our families back through changing languages, and it culminates in me. But it was many of my ancestors who survived diseases, won wars, that enabled this voice to be passed down to myself. But this is not my voice. It is the voice that is owed to my children and to my great-grandchildren as well. Also, I just wanted to say my Gwitchin name, my real name that my grandmother gave me, used to be Dasloti, which was the name, interestingly enough, of a man about 6 or 7 generations ago who brought one of the first peace between the Vuntut Gwitchin of northern Yukon, Alaska, and NWT, and the Jinikai, or known today as the Inuit people. And I've thought about that a lot. But now my name has changed. because of my daughter, who an elder and family member from the matrilineal line of our people, Lorraine Nitro, gave my daughter the name Chi'jintal, which means young eagle. So now my name changes to Chi'jintalti, father of young eagle. And it helps to remind me that everything that I say here today is not for me, but it's for my daughter, but also your daughters. So as I speak, I'm going to bring you through some I'm going to challenge some norms. I would like for you to listen and be aware of your emotions, your resistance, everything, but let's move through these things. I've decided to speak to you today out of a very deep place because I respect you. I respect your work. And as people, and sometimes, I mean, in modern day, you know, when I get introduced to someone, one of the first things they ask is, what do you do? As if that job is who I am. It does inform some principles and parts of myself, but it's not who I am. And that question is very important. Also, I want to recognize that some people have made the mistake of calling me intelligent. I'm not. I'm a very great parrot. I listen, I read, and I relate that in my communities and my conversations. And I love sharing education because of the shifts in perspective that it has afforded me, which I think is one of the most important functions as a human being. But I'm not going to sugarcoat things. There may be aspects of this talk that could be challenging for some individuals. But remember, this is not my voice. I'll let you know when I have my opinions, but a lot of this is from the information that I accumulated throughout my life. Now, this hunger for information in my life is what I've come to realize is my trauma response. My traumas began at 4 years old. And the people who were supposed to be looking after me in my life, the adults, did not have the tools to do so. Residential school worked far better than you know, and we can still talk about it, but I see it. I see it in some of our elders, and I see it in this next generation as well. This level of pain that was inflicted leads to anger. And that's something I dealt with for a very long time. But science became my parent at a very young age, because in a confusing world where hypocritical adults were telling me what I should be thinking and what I should be feeling, it didn't make sense to me. I ended up failing high school, but I never stopped reading science on my own. And the reason why I failed high school was because I had bigger questions than school could give me at that time. Now, I think schooling is very important. But for instance, in my grade 10 biology, when the teacher said that we were going to begin to talk about genes and DNA, I had been reading on that for years, and I had just all these questions. The Mayan perspective on DNA, where they say that you and I are not the real animal, DNA is. A very interesting perspective. So many questions. And I remember the teacher saying, yes, yes, you know, that's the thing, but we're not gonna touch that in this course. And she lost me right there. It was in grade 6 when my father handed me a book, Sociology for Beginners, that I realized I was being a sheep in school. And it changed the way that I looked at human beings interacting with one another. And that was it. I could not stop reading after that. Psychology, epistemology, history, monetary systems, legal systems, European cultures, indigenous cultures. By the time I was in grade 8, at 13 years old, I had run away from home, was already addicted to drugs, but underneath my mattress, I had Schrodinger's cat. At that time, I was into quantum physics. So it's, I've had a challenging relationship with society. So how does that all equate to where I am today? And yes, we did do a lot of great work from a self-governing indigenous institution, which is kind of like your epidermis. Our agreements were a reaction to the colonial bacterias and all those things that threatened our stability, which came through our knowledge systems. So now that we have this legislative epidermis that allows us to interact with the colonial system in different ways, we're able to help it move its thinking and bring unity and community and all of these wonderful things. One of my favorite parts about disease, and let's give disease a fair shake here. It doesn't have morals or ethics. And I love these deep questions about where does intent begin in biology? As from a conference through Northern Berkeley, California, 300 physicists and biologists came together to ponder this question. And they said, if you drop a bowling ball and a feather, they fall at the same rate as Newtonian calculus and math works. But what happens if you drop a bowling ball, a feather, and a pigeon? Although we are biological entities that adhere to physics, what changes us from inanimate matter is intent. But where does that intent derive? Was there intent in the first cell in the ocean? Now, moving from the ocean, the very heart that beats in our chest is our genetic memory of the ocean. In this way, I've found science to actually back up our elders and a lot of this traditional thinking. But again, it's not the only form of knowledge. And one thing that I've finally settled on is that I'm never really going to find the truth, because from my first few questions getting into science, I found some truths that work for us or maybe us at the time. But really it was metaphor that helped me become a better person. So what I'm trying to say is science and knowledge will get you so far, but what makes you a better person? What makes you happier? What makes you healthier? What enables you to be a teacher and stronger in your communities? That's most important. But again, science backs up a lot of this knowledge that could be looked at. Well, it is romanticized a lot of the time, indigenous stories, which are pertain to actual history and then what is to teach. Now, Joseph Campbell writes, who is somewhat of the Noam Chomsky of his field. Joseph Campbell, who studied stories, religions, traditions, fables, and legends around the world, said something profound. He said that these stories and legends were not ways in which to understand our environment and universe, but rather it was to partake in the rapture of it. It was to be. Now, as I speak to you now, I am a recent survivor of a near fatal episode of a very rare form of aseptic meningitis. If I take Tylenol, my body attaches a fat to the acetaminophen in the wrong place, and I basically go into sepsis, shock, and die. I barely survived this and am now recovering. I actually have effects as I'm speaking to you right now. I have effects with my short-term memory, among some other things. But I don't take that experience personally. I hold no ill will towards aseptic meningitis and the rest. In fact, I'll be honest with you, death would have been very easy for me. I don't remember the day. I would not have remembered anything. It would have been hard for my family and for everybody else. But one thing that I am glad for is what I decided to take from it. Now, growing up, I had many near-death experiences, both self-inflicted and by accident, either through drug overdose or car accidents. And for some reason, I've lived through all of this and am a statistical anomaly, as 30% of my friends are deceased, and also others are having a very hard time in their lives because they weren't afforded some of the opportunities that I were. Now, what I get from this is that my 9 lives are almost up, and now my life has changed, and I have to become more active on a lot of my thoughts. Now, that being said, we have some very serious issues, but history was defined by disease. We know that malaria, which came from the Italian word malaria, which is bad air, they didn't know it was mosquitoes at the time. A lot of people don't know that after the British Tea Act and the Boston Tea Party and the United States working towards a republic, 7,000 British soldiers landed in southern United States. And they were going to take the United States by storm. But as the soldiers moved north, they were exposed to a strain of malaria they had never seen before, and the entire army was wiped out, and the United States stands today. Um, there are some other matters, though, that exist right now. Of course, COVID that we've gone through. But I'd like to share with you some observations I made. First of all, I'm very concerned how our world responded to it. First of all, our systems, regardless of invisible borders and governments, should have made the vaccine free. Canada should have been giving out, everybody should have been giving out this vaccine. But even more troubling was the layman's response to COVID. Now, I just want to set the floor right here. If COVID was man-made, it was done with technology we don't know about and is far more complex than anything synthetic. It was not man-made, but myself being 36 and my generation, I hear a lot of people talk, and a lot of this conversation is steeped in conspiracy. And this is a really large problem when we use language, and especially scientific terms, standardized, because what we're doing is we're creating a bridge between our minds and we're relaying concepts and ideas. Now, if that breaks down, I don't really know what to do with you anymore. And the problem I see, which is a disease of thought, is the way that science works is we have a hypothesis, we have an idea, and we do everything we can to disprove it. But now what I see happening is someone has a truth that they need to be true or just fits their worldview, and they find everything to support it, which is the exact opposite. I think that we may now be witnessing the beginning of the fall of the American Republic. And I don't use these words lightly or to fearmonger. But when we see the breakdown in ideas and language, we see the breakdown of society. Noam Chomsky himself says that the GOP is the most dangerous political organization in the world. And the reason why I bring this up is because as an indigenous person, but also being half a German, I've gone down into both societies and knowledge systems very deeply. And now I see where they can connect instead of where, they break apart. And one of the most important teachings from our people, there was a woman among our people who spoke, I believe it was in the 70s, and she said, in the future, there will be hard times. And she said, many people from the South will come to our lands and they will be hungry, and you have to be there to help them. Now, this came from a woman whose children were taken and removed from her family and the community and our whole nation, and came back broken. This woman still made very sure that people like me who never got to meet her know that we have to be there to help one another. That is probably the strongest act of strength I have ever seen or known of in my life. And I strive to one day become an elder that learns how to harbor that amount of love for our brother. now that we've arrived at this place of thinking, I'll share something that kind of scares me right now, which is chronic wasting disease, which I believe originated in Ohio, but is a prion-based disease in ungulates. Now, they've immolated deers, deer populations, infected deer at 1100 degrees, and the ashes are viral. There is no vaccine, there is no inoculation. It is a malignantly folded protein. This is spreading. It is in Europe, in the reindeer populations, and it's headed north. Now, because I did not understand this, I had to study. And in humans, we found a malignantly folded protein within the Papua New Guinea populations that practice cannibalism. Now, within their culture, it was usually the women and the young children who practiced this cannibalism, and the disease metastasized around when they were 35. It was a terrible and it was a debilitating disease, but this disease did not develop by itself. It developed from a malignant form of thought. It was our actions and our interactions with the world that summoned this into being. So now think of the Columbian Exchange. This was an exchange when Christopher Columbus had made contact with the Azteca of the time, and it was very beneficial for Europeans. They had the potato, for instance, which very roughly you could say that 1/3 of Europe's population today is responsible because of the potato and how nutritious this was. But they only brought back 4 types of potato, whereas in South America, there are thousands of species of potato. So that variety, as we know, is a principle of nature that banks on diversity and rewards cooperation. One potato blight debased Ireland, and their people suffered greatly. This same blight would be like throwing a pea at an elephant in South America. The strong genetic variety created strength. So when we look at chronic wasting disease now, this is coming because of human interactions with animals. Now, the diseases that Christopher Columbus and his crew passed to the indigenous peoples were because Europeans lived with horses, lived with chickens, they lived with all these animals. And as you well know, when you live with animals, you're gambling. You keep pulling that that machine in the casinos, the slot machine, and sure enough, one of these days it's going to happen, like COVID coming from a bat genome changing this virus. But again, the virus does not have a constitution. It does not have an opinion on politics. It is not to blame. And as I said, I really value shifts in perspective. When in my community, we were looking at what COVID could mean for our community, I happened to have a discussion with a medicine woman that I know in British Columbia, who's also been an important part of my life because of her clairvoyancy, which should not be able to happen according to science. But there are certain things I just, I'm not to understand, and that's okay. But what she had told me about COVID is she said, why do you think Creator would give rise to this? And, she's a medicine woman. I'm not going to presume to answer. It was rhetorical. But her answer to me helped me deal with some of the fear. She said that our grandmothers and grandfathers have been working very hard. And she said that the COVID virus is here to prevent a lot of suffering in the future. And I walked away from that conversation thinking, and a lot of people started questioning society, started questioning government, and I don't mean the conspiracy theory, I mean like in a good, healthy way, really started looking at our systems. And I'm not sure if people understand just how incredibly destructive this disease was. Now, very luckily, I think it had a 1% fatality rate around the world, but just we're very lucky it was not as fatal as we may have thought. And our society around the world responded the best way it knew how. We're now dealing with insane amounts of inflation as central banks around the world dump money into the market. Um, transportation lines broke down around the world. Trucking companies went out of business. We're still dealing with the effects, and we will continue. Now, I'm working on another project with chronic wasting disease, and what troubles me about this is not just necessarily the disease itself, but our reaction to it. And I see many breakdowns between academia, between governance and policy, and the way that our system responds to these things. Now, being loving history as much as I do, it's really interesting that Canada was founded as an anti-US nation. Lord Byron saying, if you want to lose Canada, keep going with your ignorant policy to the Parliament in the UK. He said, but if you want to keep Canada, give them dominion. Actually, studies show that Canadians derive more national pride from our healthcare system than even our flag. So, as an Indigenous person, it was very interesting seeing our people's reaction to COVID. And full disclosure, we have about 230 community members. There was one person in our community who told me that China had created it and it was, this and that. But we were actually the first community in Canada to reach herd immunity. Our first couple of vaccinations, we had a 98% vaccination rate. It was incredible to see a tight-knit community and how we work together, and how we value one another. Another one that really surprised me, for instance, is we had studies in our community regarding a disease that is present, HB pylori. And with no incentive, no money, no gifts, 63 to 65 community members of 250 provided urine, blood, and hair samples to the study. If you were to take those same numbers to cities, I mean, it's just incredible. But let's take a look at some of the thoughts that provide us this strength as Indigenous peoples, and something I'm about to introduce that may be challenging for some individuals. In Indigenous pedagogies and Indigenous systems, a sign of wealth is to give. The more that you give shows that you know the land, that you're able to harbor from it, and that you can create this abundance. If we want to talk about diseases, let's talk about capitalism. I have a very hard time celebrating someone like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, who is looked at, they're on the covers of Forbes magazine, all of these different things. But something very simple for me is, I don't think we need circuits in our head or we need to go to Mars. If you wake up every single morning and have enough money to feed the entire world 3 times over and decide not to every single morning, I don't believe, and from my cultural teachings, that is not something to be celebrated, but something that capitalism in the society that we inherited did. Now, that type of amassing, individualism is very detrimental to society. Just imagine what that money would mean to people around the world, connecting families, all of the rest. Now, another idea that I just want to get out of the way is that you and I are not capitalists. We practice commerce within a capitalistic system. But I'm also not just going to damn capitalism. And, that was my teenage years when I was, society should burn, we should restart. No, no, no. There have been a lot of wonderful things, a lot of good things. I believe our system has some fundamental issues with its principles, but there are a lot of things that work. And I want to take a moment to recognize the nurses and the doctors in our society, because I had teachers tell me, I don't know what you're doing in my classroom. You're just going to end up in the penitentiary, in prison anyway. I've been mistreated by RCMP officers. I've been mistreated by a lot of individuals who were empowered by our society. Not all of them, but how wonderful I was treated in the hospital. Teams of doctors working from across the West Coast, the nurses, reminded me why we made society and that there is still a lot of good in these institutions and in our intentions. But let's look at not CWD, not coronavirus. I wanted to take the last remaining bit of my time to express the concept that I believe colonialism is a disease of thought, and I call it a psychokinetic disease. From my purview, I'm watching colonialism eat its own young. It has stripped communities of any meaningful platform to have a relationship with Indigenous peoples. Now, let's be clear. Indigenous peoples of Canada make up 5% of the national population, but yet we have the pre-existing right to land claims and to self-governance, as Canada was founded on the preservation of Indigenous title as realized in the Royal Proclamation. But we're not an election winner. Yet there is a record winning streak in the courts. But the problem with this is implementation of our agreements should not be done through litigation and through education systems that have robbed our non-Indigenous brother of any meaningful knowledge. They cannot create relationships. Reservations have separated us from these cities and these communities. My belief is the Great Wampum Belt was the first founding legal document of Canada. The Royal Proclamation was merely the British's form in which to deal with the French. And that was with dealing with, partnering with First Nations and the rest. Now, let me give you an example about this diseased form of thought. Two examples. Living in Vancouver, I had some friends who were really, really punk, put safety pins through their ears and they're like anti-system, all of this. So they came down to Vancouver at the time I was living there and they said, Dana, we want to go to this punk shop. Can you bring us there? So I did. And they went around shopping, buying all this anti-system stuff and, we're punk, we're punk. And I started looking at the tags. These were companies that were selling them this notion, but these punks unknowingly were actually strengthening the system that they thought they were so against. And I thought, how tricky and intelligent is this capitalistic system? It will sell you anything that you desire. But let's be clear, capitalism and our modern society does not dream. It does not have a heartbeat. It's actually quite subject to, as my father would say, if you want to look at the health of a democracy, look at its institutions of the Supreme Court, of its leadership, its education systems, its media, etc. Another quick example is, let's take a look at racism, for instance. Racism has no scientific basis. First of all, there's only one race, the human race. Your skin color has to deal with your ancestors' exposure to UV light. It does not denote intelligence or anything of the sort. But what I'd like you to imagine is, imagine a child born in, let's say, rural Alabama, and their whole entire family is racist. Even though it has no scientific basis, it is not truth. The Greeks would refer to children as tabula rasa, blank slate, what is to be written on them. This parasite of racism infects this new mind, and it is rewarded through the host's actions. So at what point, when we look at the unstoppable destruction of our planet, 60% of our planet now being destroyed, how is capitalism being rewarded through your actions? And it seems unstoppable, but there are solutions and there are vaccinations and inoculations. Let's take, for instance, the gun. If you take a gun and you wipe out a buffalo species with it, it's not a very good thing. But what's very interesting is what the gun did for my community was incredible. It helped our people so much, weather bad times of hunger. But a gun in my ancestors' hands strengthened the animals in our area. Now, how would it do that? For instance, if you're trapping, the elders taught me, Look for marten that have scars or there's missing parts of fur. And they said that's where you trap because they're overpopulated and they're fighting for territory. So when you trap there, you kind of thin out the populations a bit in a manner that makes their lives better and your life better. So now let's extrapolate this to a moral haphazard endeavor by our society, which was the reduce, reuse, recycle program that popped up in the 90s. And we all understand it and we can get behind it. Unfortunately, it hasn't worked. It hasn't done anything about planned obsolescence in companies that actually build products that are supposed to break down. You know, we could be building light bulbs that last multiple generations, but that's not profitable. So that doesn't happen. A lot of our recycling in Canada gets shipped off into Asia where it's burned. I mean, just at the end of the day, without going into too many details, it hasn't done what it really was aimed to do. But let's take a look at some indigenous principles. As one of my elders, Mark Wedge, had taught me, indigenous principles of reciprocity, relationship, and respect govern all of our interactions. Now, it's really hard to practice reciprocity in a grocery store. But relationships and respect, I always ask myself about what is my relationship with this food that I'm eating. And I recognize that our society is not treating these animals with respect, and that's where things like mad cow disease come from. But I respect and I understand these things. What my work has now become, and for instance, with our international climate declaration, this was also mirrored about 50 to 60% verbatim and passed by the Indigenous Peoples Secretariat among the permanent participants of the Arctic Council. So I believe that was at the Arctic Summit, Arctic Leadership Summit number 6. So you can find this on the internet. There is an international circumpolar Arctic Indigenous Climate Change Emergency Declaration. And this declaration, when I was speaking with our lawyer, what I was scared about is usually these emergency declarations are attached to immediate federal funding. But we didn't have that infrastructure in our agreement with the federal government. And so our climate emergency was actually to change conversations and to change thinking. Not only do my people experience climate change 3 to 2 times more than the rest of the world, we experience colonialism 2 to 3 times more. Than so many things are put on our people and they're not allowed to just live their lives. For instance, even speaking to you today, which I deeply respect, not because of who I am, but simply in the opportunity to share some of the ideas that I've kind of picked up along the way. Um, uh, these experiences I've been forced to metabolize and give back to society in this way. But really, I want to be an artist. I want to draw. I want to do all of these things, but it's really not my choice, and I'm okay with that. What was very difficult for me as a young person, but also as a young Indigenous person, was to have a meaningful relationship with society, with Canada, and with our history. But here's the real point and the real charge. You and I have inherited this nation. You and I have inherited colonialism. And I want to be very clear. I refer to colonialism as a psychokinetic disease, a disease of thought, because it's not your fault. This is something you inherited. And you and I have to work together to do better. And my people have many teachings about this. We've lived in our lands for over 30,000 years, and our presence strengthened the land. Now, I get inspired from individuals like John F. Kennedy, who stood on a podium before the entire world and said, in 10 years, we are going to be on the moon. They did it in 9. The telemetry did not exist. The technology did not exist. So I will not listen to anybody who tells me that we cannot do this. There are incredibly scary studies out there about the 50 tons of mercury that are locked away in the ice, about the feedback methane loop cycles that we're setting off. Nature is speaking very loudly. But whatever may threaten me or provide me with fear, I will meet it with forgiveness and open heart. But this is the difference, not just my mind. You see, the difference between traditional knowledge and modern knowledge is that since the Library of Alexandria and before, the non-Indigenous peoples go to a university to learn about the universe, whereas Indigenous peoples turn the universe into our university. Now, no one form of knowledge is better than the other. They actually are stronger together. So what I'm trying to say is I've learned how I can have models in my mind of intellect, but it's not really powerful until it's connected with my heart. A quick example, I can tell you about World War II. I can tell you about all these, but when I was forced to learn about it to pass a test, I approached that information differently. When I sat across the table from my Oma, who told me she stood in the city of Lubeck while 40,000 Germans burned alive, she was half Jewish. And the life that she went through, there were tears streaming down my face because that was my story and I was connected to that. I think the real success of colonialism is by cutting people off from their stories and connecting them into a society that provides them their values. Because when I was down in the city, I had a great job. I had my own house. I had a vintage 1970s leather jacket with low cut Italian boot. I had it all. I had it all. And I never felt so empty. People on the bus treat you like you're insane if you try to talk to them. My own neighbors didn't want to talk to, and I realized I was a tumbleweed. I was being blown around by what was happening in the economy. I lost my job because of 2008. I was chasing, popular things that my generation does. But here's what stopped everything. My grandfather, old Peter Tija, is what the elders say will be the last man to have dog teamed from Dawson City to Old Crow. And the reason why he did that, he left his land to become, he was a proficient hunter and trapper, celebrated somewhat in our community back then. And he became an illiterate janitor just so he could be close to his kids in the residential school. And he had to leave it. That life was killing him. So he took a 3-month journey and he dog teamed all the way back up to our community. And you know what he did? He brought a bag of candy with him, which the children in our community never see. But guess what? He did not give that to them because he would have been that given that credit. He gave it to his mother so his mother could give it out to the children because he didn't want that individual benefit, I guess. And as soon as he got to the community, he learned of his brother having a hard time, and he got right back on that sleigh and went all the way out and helped his brother. When I'm dealing with colonial governments, and I see it all the time, their reaction to perhaps our agreements or what we're proposing, I feel a lot of fear on the other end, as if this is a power struggle between our agreements and your government. They have a lot of power, but what they don't understand is what we're trying to do with this power is provide balance, not overpower the other individual. With the environment, we should not try to overpower the environment, but create balance with it. One of the biggest problems with this is corporations and their form of economy and just take and take and take. You know what's very interesting? I believe that just like that gun, the corporation is a tool. And if we continue to use it the way that we do, it will not be good. But what if corporations ran on the indigenous principles of reciprocity, relationship, and respect? And these ideas, it's not cultural appropriation. All of us can partake in this. So just with the last minutes of my presentation before I open up for questions, for the first time, I'm announcing a project that I'm working on. We call it the Nagli project. Nagli means one mind or rebirth. We now have a working prototype of a closed artificial intelligence system that is working off of indigenous agreements, off of modern treaties. There is no language model. It will not write you a report, but it's like the world's best librarian. It's able to give you citations. It's able to give you curriculums in seconds. Now, we plan to scale this closed system to include federal, Yukon Territorial, and Yukon First Nations agreements, laws, and regulatory regimes so that our Canadian brothers, when we sit down at the federal transfer agreement tables or any negotiations, it demystifies these documents. And I will say that Adam Smith, when he looked ahead, when he wrote Wealth of Nations, he said that unfortunately slavery was an important part of civilizations, and he didn't see that ending. Well, not even 100 years later, the British Empire illegalized slavery. So what I ask you, in a parabolic rise in human civilization history, what is it that we're not seeing in the future? And how can we derive the strength and the communities to look in that future together and honor all of our ancestors and grandparents by pulling from this future the best of who we are? This society and this government is not good enough for all of us, but it's our responsibility to get inside of it and help to teach it and guide it. Because as the father of young eagle, my daughter's depending on us and she's depending on you. So I appreciate the time. And I'd like to open up the floor to any questions, please.
Thank you so much, Dana. A really powerful presentation. And thank you for sharing your time and experiences with us today and creating the space for us to reflect on our own experiences and emotions. Like Dana said, if anyone would like to ask a question, you can pose it using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If you do raise your hand, it's a little tricky to see and kind of unmute and mute respondents. So we do highly encourage typing your questions into the Q&A chat. And I do see that some are coming in. First question for you, Dana. Did you write any books or do you have any reading suggestions?
Oh, that's such a question. I am, like I said, reading and science, and that's my trauma response because I only feel comfortable if I can understand my environment. But I love science so much. Okay, one of my number one book recommendations is War of the World Views, co-authored by Leonard Mlodinow, who is a particle physicist who worked with Stephen Hawking, but also Deepak Chopra, who's a metaphysicist. And so they get one question each, and they each get to write an essay on it. So it's completely opposing worldviews, World of the Worldviews, wonderful book. And I don't know.
I'm not sure. There you go. Okay.
But I have a book coming out next year that I've been working very hard on. So keep an eye out for that one. I did it.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you, Dana. I'm sure we'll all be keeping an eye out for that one. Another question coming in. Dana, thank you for your candidness and willingness to share your story with us in this forum. And thank you for your leadership and stewardship and stewarding in a future of low carbon resilience while also speaking truth to power. I really appreciate your truth telling and the messaging around how we communicate to counter misinformation, including around the myths of capitalism. Are there lessons from your engagement with others that might help treat what you refer to as disease of thought? What tips, tools have you found useful? Great question, Chris.
Definitely. This is a very, very important question. And I want to say the hardest thing, I think for men in general, but the hardest thing to deal with is anger. And because as men, we're very strong. Okay, let me put it this way. I used to brag about all the fights that I won in high school. I physically beat up the Yukon judo champion in Yukon, but what happened is I made an emotional shift where I realized this is somebody's son. This is going to be a father one day. And I couldn't imagine that happening to my dad. So I started shifting over to nonviolence. And I'm very happy to say that I don't think I've been in a physical altercation in almost 20 years almost. So here's the thing. what I've also learned in politics and on international forums, I thought that I had to be really, really smart and really technical. So I would be reading 300-page environmental impact assessments before sitting down. And what I've actually found out is that if you make room for the human heart, the mind will follow. And
Mhm.
Einstein wasn't scared of this at all. He said the imagination is the most important thing that we have, but he also said God doesn't play dice. And that was kind of his projection. And we know that E equals MC square does not fit with quantum physics. So that's a fundamental part of our universe that we can't create that composure with. So what I'll say is when you're dealing with these people who are steeped in conspiracy theory, it's actually emotional. And if you try to overpower them intellectually, they're going to get kind of offended. What you do is you tell them, I hear you. That's very interesting. But what I ask them is, what do you want me to do with that information? Because if
Mhm.
you're, and I'll tell you an extreme case. I had someone try to convince me that there are shape-shifting lizards living in the earth and the queen, and so all of this stuff. And I
Mhm.
listened because probably his family doesn't listen to him, but I asked, what do you expect me to do with that knowledge? And just start asking them more questions that will break down their thinking, teach them how to ask, because it's actually, in my opinion, it's anger and an emotional issue with society is
Mhm.
where that basically comes from. So try to be loving, try to be patient. That is the hardest lesson. And I think it's even harder for men, but in any case.
So true. Yes. Thank you, Dana. I don't see any more questions in the chat right now. Dana, is there anything you'd like to leave our attendees off with today?
Definitely. Definitely.
Please.
I'll just say, and again, I've got high respect for science, but we've basically proven objectivity really breaks down at the quantum level. By observing something, we actually affect it. And there's this notion that I love. It's called the quantum ability to collapse probability wave functions. What that basically means is your perception of E equals mc squared, of mass relative to movement and speed, is all in your head, but it's not just all in your head, but theoretically, the universe is pure probability. And your brain, like a gerbil running on a ball, collapses everything into what you're experiencing. Now, that's a really important concept because for me, I need to connect knowledge to my heart and this trivia, but use these in a manner that brings people together. There's so much division out there. What I would say is one of the most important things, and as you move forward in your work around disease and around science is extremely important.
Mhm.
But how are we going to institute this into policy and into forms and acts of governance that create this change? This is one of the biggest issues we have. One of my favorite books of all time is The March of Folly by Barbara Tuchman, which is basically about organizations that institute policy that lead to their own downfall. Now, for instance, the hippie movement in the 60s, it was wonderful. You know, go to San Francisco, wear flowers in your hair. And I know I have a little bit of time, which is why I'm taking it. Don't be nervous. I'm
Please.
almost
Nope.
done.
Please.
So leaving San Francisco, I was in a limo and I was in there with an elderly gentleman.
Mhm.
And it was about 4 o'clock in the morning. He was bringing me to the airport. So I asked him if he knew about it. And he said, man, I was 12 years old when that happened. And he told me about what San Francisco was like then. And I was just blown away. But we came to this lull in the conversation. And I asked him, what happened? And he said, well, they got a haircut and they bought a suit and they got a job.
Mhm.
Now, imagine if the love movement brought something back for policymakers, something for legislators. You know what the legislators did? They looked at Dennis or Timothy Leary and the rest of them, and we got the DEA. And there was this huge push actually back against what they were doing.
Mhm.
So, how do we, as individuals doing this work, have it reflected in institutions of our government that benefit later generations? And that's something I'm still working on as well.
Mhm.
But just lastly, I'll say that There's all kinds of things I didn't get to go into, but I will tell you, there are wonderful and intelligent people all around the world who are working so hard on this and about climate change and these things. And I'll tell you, we will be successful in some way, in one way or another. And we should not ask for an easy life, but a meaningful one. And if we can take that attitude together, create these communities, then we've done half the battle right there. So I really want to give my respects, and on behalf of my elders and my people and my family, honored to share with you all. And I really hope that I've been able to share with you in a way that strengthens your life as well. Masicho.
Thank you, Dana. Thank you so much. I'm just going to end on one last question. We do have one last one from Lucas.
Okay.
I think this is a great way to end off. Again, so many comments coming in. Incredible speaker, very touching. Thank you for your profound truths and sharing your story. The last question we're going to end off is, how do you stay hopeful in the face of inaction? And where do you focus your energy to make an impact, especially when stonewalled by senior leadership, which I think you were touching on. So,
okay, this is very important. And so, like I said, I grew up as a warrior. I was basically like in a gang, and I was fighting all the time. And you know what's really interesting? I found that in a fight, and I'm sorry I have to use this analogy, I'm not a violent person, but I found out that you won or lost a fight in the very beginning. If you looked in that other individual's eye and saw fear, that was it. But if they looked in your eye and saw absolutely no fear, they'd be like, wait, why is this guy not scared? And same thing with animals. They do the same thing. A bear, if it charges you and you don't move, that bear's like, whoa, this guy is not scared of me. He
right.
knows something I don't. But where do you get to that place? Now, I'd also recommend readings like Miyamoto Musashi and the Book of Five Rings, but this is what they say. Ancient warriors said that the path of the warrior was a spiritual one. And what that basically means is, if you are not scared of death, you cannot be killed. And also, if I could take another moment to point out something in colonialism. I actually think that colonialism is fear-based, and that colonial culture has a very perverted relationship with death. And I think that's why their societies subjugated women, because women in our society we recognize them for their strengths, like women's issues and these gender issues. Those aren't issues in my community, which I find very interesting. They're not issues, but I watch the modern world struggle with it. It's really interesting. So what I will say is, you need to connect with something beyond yourself. Like, for instance, I don't know what happens after death. And shortly, this is what I'm actually sharing with you, came from a Buddhist monk, a Rinpoche Poita Ling, who I got to spend some time with. Look, I don't know what happens after we die. What I tell myself is that if Creator wanted us to know, we would know. But look, you spent a lot more time dead than you have alive. It's okay to die. It's okay to fail. It's okay to let go. The one thing that we don't do is, now that I have children, there's a child inside. Do you treat yourself like that child? Do you talk to yourself like that child? Do you give yourself patience and love? Because look, this world, and growing up through residential school, I had a lot of alcoholism in my life. And I realized my relationship with the world has to be the same as a relationship with an alcoholic. And what that means is, I didn't create the world, I didn't cause its problems, and I'm not responsible for them.
Oh, no, I think we may have lost Dana. Just going to give it a minute here, see if he'll rejoin or unfreeze. Doesn't look like it. Apologies, everyone. Apologies for the freezing. Not sure if that's just on my end or everyone's end. Yes, it looks like we've lost Dana. Oh, he's back. Oh, good. I think you're muted, Dana. Sorry.
That was strange.
We lost you for a brief second.
Just to end that off, because I
Mhm,
mean, sitting with a Buddhist monk who spent his entire life meditating is really interesting.
mhm,
Sitting down with like a really rich and I've got to meet all these people. What I'm trying to say is that hope is endless and love is endless, and actually the strongest place. It's what impedes that. And what I want to say is that the highest act of love that I think that we can practice is forgiveness. And what I had to forgive colonists. I had to forgive Canada. I had to forgive because it was ruining my life. So when you look at the planet and you're mad and this is unfair, forgive, 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 because the world has seen enough hate. What the world actually needs is what's in our hearts. And if we can do this as a species, I believe that we and will have championed one of the greatest teachings that we could as people. And because it's not the environment that's unbalanced, it was a group of people with an imbalanced worldview. And
mhm.
the imbalance here ended up metastasizing out there. So all the environment is trying to do is teach us balance again. And it's out of love. It's so patient for us. And biology will teach us, if it wasn't for the asteroid 67 million years ago, we wouldn't have our prefrontal cortex now and be able to have this conversation. So what was disastrous for the dinosaurs was wonderful for us. And look at it this way. If we mess this up and we lose our entire species, maybe it's the cockroach's turn. I don't know.
Yeah,
Maybe, but I
yeah.
really like to believe, not because I know it, but because it gives me strength, that we will find another way to come back and have these conversations, to learn with one another and to love with one another. That's what fills me with hope, and that's what fills me with strength.
I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you so much, Dana. I can't thank you enough for being here and sharing your time today with us. Um, that being said, we're going to now take a bit of a stretch lunch break, walk around, stretch your legs, and we will begin our oral abstract session at 1 p.m. Eastern time.